This morning's message is entitled God's Sovereign Over Death and Life. God's Sovereign Over Death and Life. You know, you've probably heard someone say at some point, if you're overreacting to something, hey man, don't worry about it, it's not life or death. I mean, calm down, relax, it's not life or death, no big deal. I mean, that expression you hear people say. But one of the things we're convinced of here at our church is that even the small parts of our lives are really life and death. I mean, every moment of our lives, every season of our lives, every time we pause and look at the Bible, God's Word together, it's really life and death. It really is. And hopefully by the end of the message, you'll see what I mean by that. But before we go any farther, before we go into Exodus 7, I want to say quickly, kind of like how we define life and death, all right? And this may be obvious to some of you, but I feel like it's worth saying. It's important to clarify this before we go into the text this morning, all right? Two dimensions. When we talk about life and death, two dimensions are significant. Let's take death first. There's physical death, the fact that our bodies will one day die. And by physical death, we mean the soul leaves the body. And when that happens, you are lifeless, motionless, you cannot function, you're dead, okay? That's physical death. When we talk about spiritual death, we're talking about a soul's separation from its creator, a soul's separation from God. And the symptoms of spiritual death are discontentment, emptiness, unthankfulness, lust, cravings, enslavement, misery. Those would be the symptoms of spiritual death. So let's talk about life now for a minute, just defining our terms, okay? Physical life, the opposite of physical death. Soul still united with your body, you're functional, mobile, at least to some extent, mobile. Spiritual life, soul and God united, alive in God. The opposite of spiritual death, instead of the lack of gratitude, emptiness, lust, instead of that, the fullness, the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, fruitfulness, spiritual functioning in God. Those would be characteristics of spiritual life. So when we move through this part of Exodus, we're going to be talking mainly on the physical level in what we're seeing with the historical events that played out, but there are profound implications for the spiritual level. I hope to show you both. But as we walk through this, we'll see God operating in the physical sphere to teach some important things regarding the spiritual sphere when it comes to death and life. Physical Old Testament realities regarding Moses and Israel point us to profound spiritual realities regarding Christ and us. Chapter 7 through 12, I debated how to do this. We're moving into this section somewhat well known where we see the plagues, the 10 plagues that God brings upon Pharaoh in the process of liberating his people. And I debated how quickly to go through this, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to go through quickly this morning. We're going to see this kind of big picture summary. Later on, after Christmas, we may come back around to some of these portions. We're definitely going to come back around to the Passover, but we'll see. But this morning, I want us to get the big picture and grasp some things about God's sovereignty over death and life that can, I think, blow us away when we see who Jesus is and what it means to be identified with Him, identified with His death and with His resurrection. So that's where we're going. Before we get into the text, one last preliminary thought here. When we think about sovereignty over death and life, this is something that belongs to God alone, and yet we humans play around with it a little bit. We have our ways of trying to exercise sovereignty. We all do it in our lives, and when you look at Exodus chapters 1 and 2, you see the human players. You see Pharaoh, you see Moses, and you see them exercising a form of sovereignty over death and life. Take Pharaoh, for example. He's threatened by the Israelites being there in Egypt. He's trying to preserve his life, his kingdom. He wants things his way. And so he decides he needs to put the Israelites to work so that they will be oppressed, so that they will be weakened, and they won't threaten his power. So he's working them to death. There's a sense in which he's he's sucking the life out of them, keeping them working to produce for him, to build buildings for him, and so on and so forth. We see it in that sense. We saw in that Pharaoh sent an edict down from his throne that all the Hebrew sons needed to be killed. They should be killed. Why? Again, to protect him from any potential threats. So there again, you see him exercising a certain sovereignty over death and life as he issues this edict that all Hebrew sons are to be killed. And we know, as we've looked at in previous weeks, that he was thwarted in those efforts. He was thwarted. Putting them to work, they kept multiplying anyway. Tries to have the Hebrew sons killed, and the midwives didn't cooperate with him, and Hebrew boys were born. Moses himself is evidence of the fact that God thwarted Pharaoh's plans when it came to trying to put these children to death. Take Moses, chapter 2. We saw where Moses took justice into his own hands. He noticed that an Egyptian was bullying or abusing an Israelite, and he stepped in and he murdered that Egyptian. Remember that? That's him, in a sense, exercising sovereignty, deciding he's going to take someone's life. And then you see him fleeing to protect himself and to protect his life. So we see human players, beginning of this book, exercising a small form of sovereignty over these matters of death and life. But by chapter 3, God has showed up in the burning bush with Moses, and from that point on, he is showing himself unmistakably as the true sovereign over death and life. And that's exactly what we see in amazing ways in chapter 7 and on in this book, in this section about the plagues. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to read chapter 7, 1 through 7. Then we're going to read a later section. We're going to say a few things about it, and then I'm going to summarize the plagues and what we learn from them. And we'll see that these plagues are miracles of death. They're really signs of death, and that has some important things for us. So let's read chapter 7, verses 1 through 7 for starters, okay? It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'See, I make you as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh, that he let the sons of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst.' So Moses and Aaron did it, as the Lord commanded them. Thus they did. Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh." So here we have Moses and Aaron following God's instructions, going to Pharaoh to tell him he needs to let the Israelites go free. And God promised he was going to bring about these judgments. There are going to be judgments coming down on Pharaoh. Let's read verse 8 and following here and see how this plays out. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, 'When Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, work a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent.' So Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh, and thus they did, just as the Lord commanded. And Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh also called for the wise men and the sorcerers, and they also, the magicians of Egypt, did the same with their secret arts. For each one threw down his staff, and they turned into serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said." So here is a sign where Aaron throws down the rod and it turns into a serpent. Well, the magicians there in Egypt were able to duplicate that, to do the same type of thing, and yet Aaron's serpent devoured their serpents, a sign of the preeminence of God in this. But here we have Pharaoh seeing some signs. God is showing his power in certain limited ways here, getting his attention. It says, verse 13, "And yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened." And that will come up over and over again throughout, the fact that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Let's keep reading. Verse 14. "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water, and station yourself to meet him on the bank of the Nile. And you shall take in your hand the staff that was turned into a serpent. You shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But behold, you have not listened until now. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will strike the water that is in the Nile with the staff that is in my hand, and it will be turned to blood. The fish that are in the Nile will die, and the Nile will become foul, and the Egyptians will find difficulty in drinking water from the Nile. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the rivers, over the streams, over the pools, over the reservoirs of water, that they may become blood. And there will be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Here's this first plague, turning the Nile River into blood. And the Nile will be filled with not only blood, but dead fish. All the living creatures in the Nile will die. We'll say a little bit more about that in a second, but read just the end of the chapter, verse 20 to 25. So Moses and Aaron did even as the Lord had commanded, and he lifted up the staff and struck the water that was in the Nile in the sight of Pharaoh and the sight of his servants, and all the water that was in the Nile was turned to blood. The fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile became foul, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, and the blood was through all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. Then Pharaoh turned and went to his house with no concern even for this. So all the Egyptians dug around the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the Nile. 7 days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. I said earlier, these plagues are all plagues of death. They're all miracles of death. This first one is God hitting them right at the heart of their economy, their livelihood as a sovereign nation. The Nile River, source of water for the people, for their animals, for their crops. And God hits them hard there right away, causing all the living creatures in the Nile River to die. And it says they became foul. Right away, death. The second, and we're not going to look at these, but I'm going to summarize them for you. Okay, the second plague, there are 10 of them. The second one is frogs. And some of you know the story, and God causes these frogs to multiply to where they're just everywhere. And God says they're going to be in your houses. You're going to love this. They're going to be in your beds. They're going to be in your cupboards. Everywhere you go, frogs everywhere. And sure enough, it happens. And as you can imagine, the people are complaining. Just frogs everywhere. And then God causes all of them to die. And now you've got a whole bunch of dead frogs everywhere. And it says that they piled them up. And I'm picturing Jill's sister and her husband live in Buffalo. And we were there at Christmas many years ago. And they know how to deal with snow there much better than we do. And you go into a parking lot in the winter and they plow all that snow up to these huge piles. And I'm just picturing some of those massive piles, 12, 15, 20 feet high. I mean, just picture piles of rotting frog carcasses. And it just reeks death. I mean, smell. God's saying, look, smell the death. Yeah, I know it's gross, right? Smell the death. The next plague, gnats. It's showing up everywhere. And then flies. And it says in that section, the land was laid waste. The destruction from all these insects, just overrun by insects. And that idea of laid waste is corrupted. It goes to ruin. When Jill and I first got married, we lived in Florida. And we had an infestation at one point. I don't know if you remember this, Jill. Of course you remember this. We'd be lying in bed, and these flying ants were in our apartment, and they'd just be ricocheting off our foreheads while we're in bed trying to sleep. That gets annoying after a while. You say bad things. You think bad things when you're being kept up all night by stupid flying ants. It still makes me mad. They've got flies, gnats everywhere. Next section, the next plague is livestock. It says all their horses, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep died. Just the land filled with all these rotting, decaying carcasses. And it just reeks. And then there's boils. The skin of the people was afflicted to where they're just have these boils, rotting, corrupting, eating their skin away. It says even the magicians in that point, because the magicians are around and they're kind of copying some of these, and then they just, over time here, you see the magicians just being completely humiliated. There's nothing they can do. And now in the boils, it says they couldn't even stand. The magicians were miserable. They're dying from these boils that had shown up on their skin, on their bodies. The next one is hail, and God warns them, says, hey, look, you better get inside and get your animals, whatever animals are remaining, even saying to his people, get them inside, because these hailstones are going to kill whatever they hit, and you have men and beasts dying from the hail that came in that plague. And then there's the plague of locusts, and locusts show up, and every remaining plant, it says, they ate every remaining plant. Whatever was left after all the other plagues, after the hail, these locusts ate. I was searching on locusts just to remind myself what they look like. They kind of look like grasshoppers. I think they're in that same family. I found this video. If you want to like gross yourself out, look at this. Just look it up on YouTube. Just punch in locusts. Years ago, the country of Madagascar was overrun by locusts, and it showed video footage of these things, swarms of them, and one swarm of locusts had billions of them in it. And you just see this camera footage, and these things are just, it's like rain. They're everywhere. And they devoured the crops. Almost was like economic collapse for Madagascar because of locusts. That's what God did in Egypt. Ate everything. Just Egypt turned into a barren wasteland. Dead. The ninth plague is darkness. And everyone was afraid, and you read about it in chapter 10, and it talks about, you can just sense this ominous nature of this. It's just pitch black. And over time, anyone here, oh, Clayton, you've been up in Alaska? You've been there where it just gets dark day after. I mean, that's just got to be after a while, especially with everything else going on. I mean, it's morbid. And then you have the death of the firstborn sons, the Passover. Death of all these children. Remember, Pharaoh had tried to kill all the Hebrew children, and here we have God bringing death to them in a way they can't escape. And over, God is saying through these plagues, I am doing these things, acquainting you with death, and it's explicit over and over. He says, that you may know me, that the Egyptians may know me, that my people may know me, that they may know that I am the true God, the true King, the true sovereign, that they may know me, he says. I am reaching my hand. We looked at God's saving hand last week. He's saying, I'm reaching my hand down in that world, and I'm doing things to show myself to you. And in this instance, he is doing things to confront them with the reality of death, to make death just literally come in upon them and terrify them and humble them. And here we have Pharaoh, and this is just a testament to human stubbornness. Over and over and over again, he's resistant, he's rebellious. At times he softens and he cries out to Moses, hey, talk to your God for me and tell him, hey, I'm sorry. Can you ease up on this? And then God would ease up on one of the plagues, and then he's hardened again. And that brazen, bold rebellion comes out of him over and over again. And you have this human at war with God, and God just keeps saying, that's death to you. That's death to you. That's death to you. That's what's being communicated here. I want to show you, just look ahead, Exodus 10. Exodus 10, read verses 16 and 17. Just turn over a few pages if you were in chapter 7. It says, then Pharaoh, verse 16, then Pharaoh hurriedly called for Moses and Aaron and said, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now therefore, please forgive my sin only this once, and make supplication to the Lord your God that he would only remove this death from me. Would you beg your God to take this death away from me, please? One more place, Exodus 12. Verse 30, Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants, and this is after the Passover, this is after the firstborn children were killed. Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Death, 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 death. And you read through the section and you look at this interesting contrast. As God brings death to the Egyptians, he is meanwhile preserving the lives of the Hebrews. He's protecting them. Over and over you read that these plagues didn't touch them, didn't touch their animals, didn't touch their area where they were living. They were spared. And of course, you know the Passover. God told them specifically what to do. Kill a lamb, put the blood on your doorpost, and I will pass over. And you will survive. Here's what I want you to think about. God is bringing judgments of death upon Egypt. God is delivering his people through judgments of death. He's preserving them through judgments of death. He is causing them to survive. None of them are touched with the death that destroyed Egypt and the Egyptians. So think about this nexus now with Christ and who he is and what he's done. Jesus comes to us to bring us into and through a greater exodus. Note this is so important. He comes performing miracles of life. Think about his miracles. What did Jesus do when he came? Healed people, resurrected people, he fed people. Miracles of life. And then he provides life for us by taking death for us on the cross and rising for us. These Old Covenant miracles are miracles of death, precursors to the covenant of death through Moses. Now this gets a little technical and a little theological, but try to just track with this because it's amazing. Old Covenant miracles that are happening in the book of Exodus precede the giving of the law to Moses. The giving of the law, the law code, the New Testament refers to it as letters of death. It's a covenant of death. Why is that? Because back then God said, I'm going to give you my law and I'm going to let it depend upon you to some extent. If you obey, if you look later in Exodus and you look in the book of Deuteronomy, God says, if you obey me, you'll live and you'll prosper and you'll be blessed. You'll have physical life. You'll flourish physically if you obey me. If you don't, you'll have cursing. It's conditional. And God says to us, and it becomes more clear throughout his progressive revelation, that can only be death to us. You know why? Because we are not trustworthy or reliable. We cannot secure life for ourselves. He gave them an opportunity to show them you can't do it. You cannot give yourself life. You cannot preserve your life. And as a precursor to that covenant of death, we have these miracles of death. If I don't intervene, if I don't do everything for you, God is saying, the only outcome can be death. It's his way of saying, you need me. So now we think about the new covenant, in which God fulfills his own conditions and freely imparts life, spiritual life, to us through Christ. And we think about Jesus' life-giving miracles, which were precursors to the establishment of that new covenant in his blood, where he says, I took death upon myself so that you might have life given freely as a gift, so that you might spiritually live and flourish and prosper forever, not because of anything you produce. Remember, Pharaoh, work harder, you're lazy, get going. That's the echo of Pharaoh we hear throughout the first chapters of Exodus, and we've seen it over and over again. This idea, if you don't work, Israelites, you will die. That was Pharaoh exercising his version of sovereignty. And we said that's representative of satanic thinking, of self-absorbed thinking, which we all succumb to on a daily basis, which says if you're going to really live, and catch this, if you're going to really live and thrive spiritually, here's the lie that we all fall into every day, you need more. You need more relationally, you need more materially, you need more professionally, you need more whatever, in whatever sphere of your life, you need more. You need something other than God in order to live. That's the lie. And it keeps us enslaved and it keeps us working for life. And God says that can never, ever really work for you. You need me. And so the new covenant comes, Jesus comes, he performs these miracles of life, and then he says to you, I'm your life, I'm your living bread, I'm your living water, I'm the resurrection and the life. And that happens, there's a sense in which we get that, God works in our lives, we see it, and conversion happens, and we say, wow, I've been working, trying to secure life for myself, and that has given rise to all forms of sin, whether it's the obvious pagan kind, the less obvious sterile church kind, the as Greg's terminology, the unrighteous flesh, the self-righteous flesh. That I've been operating there. It's only death to me. It's only misery. It's only emptiness. It's only enslavement. It's only hopelessness. And Christ appears, the life giver, and says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you what? Rest. And that's conversion, when God causes us and helps us to see, the eyes are opened and you see, wow, that's the gospel, that's the truth, that's what I need. That's death and life right there. That's being identified with the death and resurrection of Christ. That's us being rescued through death. We're identified with His death. His death, He takes the judgment of death. We said these plagues are these sort of precursors to this judgment of death. We, in Christ, pass through that safely because He takes the curse upon Himself. And then after conversion happens, the way we are increasingly understanding the Christian life, it's not this upward and onward Christian triumphalism, I'm getting bigger and better. I'm becoming instead more and more aware of my brokenness, more and more aware of my need, more and more aware of the fact that apart from God, all I can produce is death. And in my Christian life, moving forward, God is perpetually bringing me through these cycles of death and life, death and life, death and life, death and life. And here's what it looks like. It looks like the death of a dream, the death of the things I think I need, the death of the things you think you need, that God doesn't allow you to get. He either allows you to get them and they're unsatisfying, or He doesn't allow you to get them and you're enslaved with that craving and stuck there either way. You know, the plagues God brought upon the Egyptians. If you look, some of you have a MacArthur study Bible. If you look in there, you'll see that, and scholars just associate each one of those plagues with one of the deities of Egypt. They had their own false gods, and every one of those plagues, and even the frogs were symbolic of a certain form of divine beauty and things like that, which is hard to imagine for some reason for me. But nevertheless, there's these associations. Here's what God's saying to those people. Look, I'm striking you right where you live, what you value, what you think secures you and protects you and provides for you. He hit them right there. And there's that old part of us, that fleshly part of us, that godless part of us that's just like the Egyptians saying, I need stuff here. And so here's what God does. Here's what Christian growth looks like, is when God starts to tamper with those things that you think you need, that you value too much. When I hear a wife saying, I want my husband to be this, and he won't be, and he even can't. I'm realizing now, if people say to me all the time, I'm realizing, Jeff, he can't be that for me. There is God bringing you through a form of death, not ultimately to harm you, but to bring you to life and freedom there. And the husband turns around and says, yeah, I know I can't. I mean, look, I gave up a long time ago trying to be what she needs me to be. And I feel the weight of this expectation and pressure. And I wanted her to just sort of be a little more easygoing person. And I don't get what I want either. And there's a death, in a sense. Or the person who's obsessed with their health and they try to do everything to keep their health in a certain order, and yet still things go wrong. And it doesn't work out. And there's fear and there's insecurity. Or the workaholic who says, I'm going to get more and more. I'm going to attain higher levels here at the office or in whatever other sphere. And the work is just incessant and constant. And it goes and goes and goes. And then that person ends up even achieving many of those things. Maybe all those things. And they say, this isn't even what I thought it was going to be. I still don't get the respect that I want. Or whatever else I thought I wanted. Here's a God who loves us enough to reveal to us in countless different ways that every endeavor apart from me, God says, will only bring you to the outcome of death. That's all it can ever be. This is gracious in terms of what God is doing to the Egyptians for the Egyptians. He even says there back in chapter 7, so that the Egyptians might know who I am. This is an outpouring of love for God to tell us, look, this is the truth. It's the truth. And every day I need to hear it and you need to hear it. And every day God is bringing us through the cycle of death and life, death and life, death and life. Christmas time, Jesus came when it was cold and dark and dead. And you think of this time of year. And here comes this little tiny package, this little human being. I was talking about it last week, still blows me away. You have these, we kept using the word last week, big word, anthropomorphisms. God uses this literary device to describe himself as having a hand or an arm or face or eyes. And we said last week that he keeps using that word hand, that his hand is going to act on behalf of his people. And we said, here comes Jesus, thousands of years later, in a physical body with actual hands, reaching out to broken, needy people with salvation, touching lepers and lame and blind people and prostitutes and tax collectors. And if I was there and if you were there, he would have touched you and embraced you with those same saving hands. Another way of saying that is God comes to us with life. That's what Christmas is about, is God coming to earth with life, bringing life to us, knowing that we look in 1,000 different places for life and we end up only empty and experiencing the misery of death, and he comes with life. And he is relentless, just like Pharaoh was like, stiff arm, stiff arm, stiff arm. Same with the Israelites. Look at their history. It's the same thing. Even when they softened for a while, okay, God help us. Oh, cool, relief. Okay, good. We don't need you anymore. Thanks. We'll call you when we need you. And God said, look, it's death. It's still going to be death. So he sovereignly engineers these events, these experiences, these losses, these disappointments, to surround us with the truth that we need him, to cause us to marvel. I mean, we look at this, and it is like amazing. I'm sitting there in Sunday school listening to Don teach. It's like God in his power and beauty and greatness and love for me, the jerk that I am, and all the brokenness in my life. And it's just mind-blowing. And that's what we were created to see. And we have a God who says, I'm going to show you myself and show you myself and show you myself. And he did it then, and he's doing it now. To set us free, he lets us exercise a form of sovereignty. This is my last thought, okay? Of course, I say that. Usually I say that, and I'm editing it. Sometimes I realize I said that, and I want it for another 15 minutes after that. I'm not going to do that today, I don't think. We'll see. I don't think so. We said the stiff arms to God. I see it. I see my arm just rising up at times saying, God, I don't want that. And a big part of why I don't want that is because I could be just fine without that, which is a way of saying, God, I wouldn't need you without that. And I think part of me, that fleshly part of me still likes that idea. So the perpetual stiff arm, exercising a form of sovereignty, trying to secure for myself life on the spiritual plane. Think of how God allowed man to exercise sovereignty over him in a very important moment, approximately 33 years after Christ's birth, when man said to God, now I kill you. And God lets us do it. You talk about picking death. You just said, God, I don't want anything to do with you forever. Our nature is to do that to our Maker. And God says, here's how good I am to you. Here's how much I love you. I'm going to let you exercise that form of stupid, folly, human sovereignty over me. And I'm going to use that to win your heart. When you look upon the one you pierced and your heart melts and you say, that's the kind of love that I need. That's life. Period. Let's pray. God, thank you for the amazing message that is way beyond us, that we don't deserve to even be able to look at. And yet you invite us over and over again to look at you, to marvel over you, to marvel over your provisions, to receive life undeserved. God, convince us, please, of how great you are in your relentless pursuit of us. We need to see you. We need to be free, and we cannot free ourselves. We are overpowered by the world, the flesh, and the devil. And the only hope is your provisions through your Spirit and through your Son and what you did for us. Thank you for sending him thousands of years ago. Thank you for his life in our place. Thank you for his death, where he took upon himself judgment. Thank you that we are in relationship with him in this invincible bond because of you and your power, not ours. Help us to trust you. And God, as you bring us through daily, perpetual cycles of death and life, and we rebel and reject and we push away, help us to realize what's happening, that you're pursuing us with life. Open our eyes to see that. Help us to embrace the truth when Christ said, if anyone desires to save his life, he'll lose it. But if he loses his life for my sake, he'll find it. Help us to find life there with you, God, when there's some miraculous ability to let go of the stuff here we think we need more than you. And you show us that you're enough for us to be fulfilled and free forever because you have us, because you love us. Help us, God, to marvel over your gospel. In Christ's name, I pray. Amen.